All right, welcome in everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Definitely. Always up for digging into some fascinating stuff.
Today, we're tackling some, well, pretty heavy stuff, honestly. Look back at some of the biggest cyber hacks that have gone down in history, right? You sent over some really interesting material for us to work with those transcripts from the Greyhat Satya podcast, where they laid out their top five cyber heists and breaches. And our mission here, as always, is to go beyond just the headlines and really unpack the details.
Yeah.
Like, why did these particular events become so significant, and what can we actually learn from them?
And one thing that jumps out right away from those Greyhat Satya transcripts is how they define biggest. It's not just about, the sheer volume of data stolen or the biggest dollar amount. They're looking at it through multiple lenses, which I think is really smart. It's about like the number of people affected, sure, but also were there any political consequences? And even just the sheer audacity or the technical brilliance of the hack itself. Taking that kind of that broader perspective is what really helps us understand the true impact these incidents had and still have, I'd say.
Absolutely. This isn't just, a history lesson for the sake of it. We want to make this relevant for you because you're out there navigating the digital world every single day. So think of this as your cheat sheet, your crash course in understanding some really pivotal moments in cybersecurity. Because the truth is, those vulnerabilities, those methods that attackers used, they often, well, they have modern equivalents, right? They're not just stories from the past.
Exactly. So by really getting a grasp on what happened back then, you can actually be much better prepared for what you might encounter today. It's all about context and understanding how the landscape of threats has evolved.
All right, so let's jump right in, starting with number five on their list, the Sony Pictures hack from 2014. Now, when you compare it to some of the others we'll be talking about, the sheer amount of data stolen, it wasn't necessarily the biggest, but man, the fallout, culturally, politically, it was huge.
What's really fascinating about the Sony Pictures hack is that it kind of exposed this idea, this realization that cyber attacks can have very real, very tangible consequences in the real world. I mean, we're not just talking about financial losses or stolen credit card numbers. We're talking about a major entertainment company being targeted specifically because of the content they were about to release. That movie, the interview, the satire about North Korea's leader, well, that was the trigger.
Yeah, absolutely. And these guys, these guardians of peace, as they call themselves, they didn't just, grab data and run. They used this nasty stuff called wiper malware. And wiper malware, it's not just about stealing data. It's about destroying it completely, making it practically impossible to recover, which is exactly what Sony experienced. But before they hit the delete button, they managed to copy a ton of stuff. I mean, everything from unreleased movies, internal emails, employees' salaries, even social security numbers. It was a mess.
This attack was a wake-up call in a few different ways. First, it really showed the world the disruptive power of politically motivated cyber attacks. The U.S. government directly blamed North Korea, and that was a big deal in terms of how nations are now viewed in the cyber arena. It wasn't just about stealing data for profit anymore. It was about using it as leverage, as a weapon. And that meant organizations, companies, they had to start thinking about geopolitical risks as part of their security strategy. It added a whole new layer to the equation.
And when we think about how they actually got in, well, it's still debated, but the source material points to a combination of spear phishing, which was used to target specific Sony employees, and then exploiting vulnerabilities in their systems that hadn't been patched. Spear phishing, it's not your average phishing email. It's highly targeted, crafted to look like it's coming from someone you know and trust within the organization. So it's way more effective. And once they were in, they were able to move around the network, laterally, gaining more and more access over time.
It's really a reminder that even the biggest, most well-known organizations can be vulnerable if they neglect basic security practices. Spear phishing preys on human error, sure, but not patching those known software weaknesses. It's like leaving the front door wide open. And the fact that they had that time, that opportunity to poke around undetected, really highlights the importance of having strong detection systems in place, something that can raise a red flag when there's suspicious activity.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that those cyber attacks, they can have consequences that go way beyond the digital world.
Exactly. And tying it back to the bigger picture, the Sony hack was kind of like an early warning sign for this growing trend of nation states using their cyber capabilities for, political game, for strategic objectives. It was a taste of things to come, unfortunately.
All right, let's move on to number four on their list, the Equifax breach of 2017. This one felt different, didn't it? Less about political maneuvering and more about a huge failure to protect, well, incredibly sensitive personal information.
Yeah, the Equifax breach is almost a textbook example of how failing to address known security weaknesses can have absolutely disastrous consequences. And when you're talking about Equifax, a major credit reporting agency, well, they're a prime target, right? They hold a massive amount of personal and financial data on millions of people.
And the scale of it, it was just staggering. Names, social security numbers, birth dates, addresses, even some driver's license and credit card numbers. Potentially 147 million people across the US, UK, and Canada. So the takeaway here isn't just about patching your systems. It's about, the systemic risk that's created when you have these massive organizations holding such huge amounts of data and then failing at even basic security. It's a huge target painted on their backs, and it makes you think twice about, who you're trusting with your data. What's their track record? Do they actually take security seriously?
And what's really mind-boggling and honestly quite concerning is how it happened. The attackers exploited a known vulnerability in the software framework called Apache struts. Now, vulnerability is basically a weakness in the code, something attackers can use to their advantage. And the really bad part is that a patch for this vulnerability had been available for months before the attack happened.
So basically, they could have prevented this entire mess if they had just installed a software update. It's almost unbelievable.
Right. It's almost too simple. And the timeline is really important here. The attackers had access to Equifax's systems for 76 days. 76 days. And during that time, they were just, siphoning off this incredibly sensitive data. It points to a failure to patch, of course, but it also raises questions about their monitoring, their ability to detect intrusions. I mean, how could someone be in your systems for over 2 months and you don't notice?
The impact was huge. Millions of people suddenly facing, long-term risks of identity theft. And the trust in credit reporting agencies, which wasn't exactly high to begin with, well, it took a nosedive, there were big fines, and it really put a spotlight on the whole question of corporate responsibility. If you're going to hold this much data, this sensitive data on people, you have a duty to protect it.
It's a fundamental question of responsibility, right? These companies collect so much of our personal information, and they absolutely have a duty to keep it safe. And applying security patches promptly, that's not some advanced technique, it's basic hygiene. The Equifax breach is a stark warning, a cautionary tale about what can happen when you neglect those fundamental security practices.
Okay, ready for a shift in gears. Let's talk about number 3, Stuxnet, which was discovered back in 2010. And I think our source is right on the money when they call this a whole different type of threat. This marked a real turning point in cyber warfare. This one blew my mind when I first read about it. The idea that you could launch a cyber attack and cause physical damage. It's on a whole other level, isn't it?
Stuxnet was a game changer because it was one of the first publicly known instances of a cyber attack, a sophisticated one, being used to cause physical damage to critical infrastructure. It wasn't about stealing information. It was about disrupting and destroying physical equipment. That was the objective.
And they targeted Iran's nuclear program, specifically that Siemens Step 7 software that was controlling these PLCs, these industrial computers, in their uranium enrichment centrifuges at the Natanz facility. Now, just so we're all on the same page, PLCs, those are basically like the brains of the operation in industrial settings, right? Controlling all the physical machinery.
Exactly. And the technical sophistication of Stuxnet was remarkable. It's widely believed to have been a state-sponsored operation, likely a collaboration between the U.S. and Israel, though that's never been officially confirmed. But what's really fascinating is how they managed to get into what was likely a very secure, maybe even air-gapped environment. Air-gapped means it's physically isolated from the internet and other untrusted networks, which makes typical cyber intrusions way harder to pull off.
Yeah, they think the main way it spread was through infected USB drives. So someone maybe even unknowingly plugged a USB drive containing the malware into a computer on the network, and boom, they were in. And once it was inside, Stuxnet used these things called zero-day exploits. Now, a zero-day exploit, that's a vulnerability that's completely unknown to the software developers. So the people who wrote the code, they had no idea this weakness even existed, right?
That's exactly it. And that's what made Stuxnet so dangerous. It was very specifically targeted, and it was designed to operate in stealth mode. It was programmed to look for very specific configurations of those Siemens PLCs, and once it found them, it would subtly change the speed of the centrifuges, causing them to break down over time. But here's the catch. It would still report normal operations back to the monitoring systems, so the sabotage went unnoticed for quite a while.
And the impact. Well, it's estimated that Stuxnet destroyed about a fifth of Iran's centrifuges, which significantly set back their nuclear program. But even beyond that, it exposed the vulnerability of critical infrastructure to these kinds of attacks. Think about power grids, water treatment plants, anything that relies on these industrial control systems. If you can disrupt those systems, well, you can disrupt real-world processes.
It was a turning point, no question. Stuxnet really blurred the lines between cyber warfare and traditional physical conflict. It forced governments around the world to really rethink how they were securing their critical infrastructure. It was a whole new ballgame.
All right, let's tackle number 2 on their list, the SolarWinds hack. This one was discovered in 2020, and it's a doozy. Our source describes it as this incredibly sophisticated and far-reaching espionage operation, and I think that's spot on.
The SolarWinds hack it's really a masterclass in how to exploit the software supply chain. You see, SolarWinds, they make this network management software called Orion, and it's used by tons of organizations, including government agencies and large companies. So right away, you can see why it would be such a juicy target for a large-scale espionage operation.
And the attackers, who they believe are this Russian state-sponsored group, APT-29, also known as Cozy Bear, they managed to compromise SolarWinds' own software development process. They actually inserted this malicious code, a backdoor called Sunburst, directly into legitimate updates for the Orion software.
And that's what made it so incredibly sneaky and effective. Organizations were basically installing malware directly from a vendor they trusted. It was coming through their normal software update process. And to make things even worse, these updates even had digital signatures, those electronic stamps of authenticity, so they looked totally legit. The SolarWinds attack really forced everyone to rethink their assumptions about trust in the digital supply chain. It was a wake-up call for organizations and individuals alike. Even your personal software, you have to be more careful about where it's coming from.
It was a classic Trojan horse delivered through a trusted channel. And once it was installed, this Sunburst backdoor, it would lay low for a while, and then at some point, it would connect back to command control servers controlled by the attackers.
And if that infected system happened to be in an organization that was of interest to them, well, then they would deploy additional, more targeted malware, things to steal login credentials, to access sensitive files, to basically exfiltrate whatever data they were after. It was a multi-stage attack, very carefully planned and executed.
And the list of victims is pretty impressive, honestly. You've got parts of the U.S. Treasury, Commerce, Energy, Homeland Security departments, and then major tech companies like Microsoft, Intel, Cisco, FireEye. It was a who's who of, well, high-value targets.
The impact was definitely significant, although it seems like the focus was primarily on intelligence gathering. They got deep access to some very sensitive networks, and they potentially had that access for months. And beyond the immediate damage, this breach really eroded trust in the software supply chain. It showed how risky it can be to just blindly trust third-party vendors, even ones that are very well established. And it really highlighted the need for much stronger security measures throughout the entire supply chain, not just at the endpoint.
All right, here we are, number 1 on their list. And honestly, it's hard to argue with this one based purely on the scale. The Yahoo breaches from 2013 and 2014, 3 billion accounts. I mean, is that even a number we can wrap our heads around? What does that kind of compromise actually mean for individuals?
It's almost incomprehensible. The Yahoo breaches are the largest known data breaches in history, just in terms of the sheer number of accounts affected. The 2013 breach, it's believed to have impacted 3 billion accounts. That's basically every single Yahoo account that existed at the time.
3 billion.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to believe. And they got a lot of data, names, email addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth. But the really worrying part is that they also got hashed passwords, and many of those were using this older, less secure hashing algorithm called MD5. And then there were security questions and answers, some of which were even stored without any encryption at all. It's just unbelievable.
And then to make matters worse, just a year later, in late 2014, there was another breach, this one affecting at least 500 million accounts. They think this one was the work of state-sponsored actors, and it involves similar types of data, but they also potentially use something called forged cookies. These are like digital keys that can allow attackers to access accounts without even needing the password. It's a very advanced technique.
The exact methods they used for that 3 billion account breach, there's still a bit of a mystery. But that 2014 attack with the forged cookies, that definitely points to a much higher level of sophistication and a more targeted approach. But regardless of the specifics, the sheer scale of it, the number of accounts, it's just unprecedented. And it's a sobering reminder that our digital lives are often at the mercy of these large organizations, and how seriously they take security.
The impact on users was massive. I mean, we're talking about billions of people suddenly facing potential risks to their privacy and their online security. And for Yahoo, the timing couldn't have been worse. This all came out right when they were in the process of being acquired by Verizon, and those revelations forced Verizon to lower their offer by a whopping $350 million. It really shows the financial repercussions that these kinds of breaches can have.
It's a clear illustration of the immense responsibility that comes with holding vast amounts of user data. And it's not just about, the obvious stuff like credit card numbers. Even seemingly less critical bits of information, when you put them all together, they can be extremely valuable to attackers.
So if we step back and look at all 5 of these events, some key themes really emerge. We've seen how crucial basic security hygiene is. I mean, patching systems in a timely manner, that's lesson number 1, as the Equifax breach so painfully demonstrated. Stuxnet showed us that state-sponsored attacks can have real-world physical consequences, blurring the lines between the cyber and physical realms. The SolarWinds hack exposed the hidden dangers lurking within our software supply chains, making us question where our software is actually coming from and who we can trust. And then the Yahoo breaches, they really drive home the sheer scale of impact that's possible when massive amounts of user data are compromised.
So for you, the listener, why is it so important to understand these historical events? Well, because they give you a much better understanding of the risks you're facing today, whether it's recognizing that sometimes cyber attacks are politically motivated, or understanding why it's so critical to keep your software updated, or just being aware of how much data those online services you use are actually holding. These lessons, they're not just history. They're incredibly relevant to your digital life today. So thinking about that Sony hack, right, a major company being targeted because of a movie, it makes you wonder, where else could these kinds of threats come from? What might trigger an attack, even against an individual? It's food for thought.
It really is. And it raises this really thought-provoking question, right? If we've seen this level of ingenuity, the scale of attack in the past, what new and unforeseen types of cyber threats might be lurking just around the corner? And how can we, as individuals and as organizations, prepare for those unknown vulnerabilities that might emerge tomorrow? That's the challenge. And that's where the real work begins.